Welcome to Corpse Club, the official podcast of DailyDead.com. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, this doesn't sound like Jonathan, this doesn't sound like Derek or Brian, and it certainly doesn't sound like Heather. I really should introduce myself. My name is James Doherty, and I'm a contributing writer for Daily Dead. This episode of the Corpse Club is dedicated to remembering one of the forgotten gems of 1990s horror, the Wishmaster. Wishmaster is a gore-filled extravaganza that sees an evil genie, or Djinn, wake from a 900-year imprisonment to try and unleash hell on Earth. In order to do this, he must grant 3 wishes to the gemologist, Alexandra Amberson, who released him. Gathering souls as he goes, the Djinn stops at nothing to target Alex, forcing her to make her wishes. The movie recently celebrated its 25th anniversary, and it is filled from top to bottom with horror Hall of Famers, both in front of and behind the camera. They include Robert Englund, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Kane Hodder, Friday the 13th franchise, Tony Todd, Candyman, Angus Scrimm, Phantasm, Harry Manfredini, composer on Friday the 13th, and Jacques Hakin, cinematographer on Nightmare on Elm Street. This was the movie that started the trend of casting multiple established horror stars in genre pictures. Although there was one horror name that took centre stage on the poster, executive producer Wes Craven. Coincidentally, Wishmaster was released in September of 1997, just 9 months after Craven's movie Scream rejuvenated the slasher subgenre and gave horror a much-needed shot in the arm. But did Scream's release help or hinder Wishmaster's success? How did the movie come about? Why an evil genie movie? Whose idea was it to have so many horror icons involved? And how hard was it to manage so many practical effects? During the next 45 minutes, you will hear from the movie screenwriter Peter Atkins, director Robert Kurtzman, and the Djinn himself, Andrew Divoff, who all discuss the making of the Wishmaster. Evil Djinn, or genie, horror movies are few and far between. Apart from 1987's The Outing and Tobe Hooper's rarely seen 2013 movie Djinn, not many have popped up. However, even though Wishmaster is about an evil Djinn that grants wishes, the movie also has a lot in common with W. W. Jacobs' short story The Monkey's Paw, a cautionary tale that perfectly encapsulates the "be careful what you wish for" motif. The original story features a father who casually wishes for £200 to pay off his mortgage, only for his son to die the next day in an accident at work. The employer takes no responsibility for the accident, but gives a financial goodwill gesture to the family. A gesture of £200. The story has been retold, adapted and reworked in The Twilight Zone, Tales from the Crypt, Buffy the Vampire Slayer and even The Simpsons. But in the mid-90s, how is an evil genie movie conjured up? Wishmaster screenwriter Peter Atkins was there from practically the beginning.
A friend of mine who I'd known from the Hellraiser movies, a guy called Eric Salzgeber, he went to work for Pierre David's company. Pierre David was the French-Canadian producer who, his greatest claim to fame is that he produced the early Cronenberg movies. And Pierre had this small production company. I get a call out of the blue. This was, I think, just after Hellraiser 3. So I was still sort of briefly, horror flavor of the month. Eric called and said, "Do you want to write an evil genie movie for Pierre David?" And I said, as any reasonable person would respond, I responded, "Fuck off. Evil genie, dumbest idea I've ever heard. If you think I'm going to waste my time preparing a pitch," at which point Eric said, "Shut up. You're not pitching shit. Your movie's a hit. The job's yours if you want it. It's a paying job." And suddenly, the idea of an evil genie movie was not so bad. So I went in to meet with Pierre, I think Noel Zanuck, who was one of his production partners, and Clark Peterson, the guy who would actually end up being the actual on-set producer, and just, had a fine time talking to them. And they'd done their due diligence, and they handed me a bunch of Xeroxed articles on Arabian mythology and jinns and things. And I thought, well, that all looks very impressive. Although I did sneer a little at the thought of an evil genie. There's no such thing. When an idea is that simple, it's neither good nor bad. You can write a good giant doll movie, or you can write a terrible giant doll movie.
Things were relatively easy for Peter Atkins, but that wasn't quite the same for FX artist and director Robert Kurtzman, who had to impress on a number of occasions, but he was given a bit of a helping hand from an old friend.
They were looking for a director. Basically, they were looking for someone who knew how to handle an effects movie. And I was coming off of my first film, Demolitionist. They started looking around and asking other filmmakers if there's any young talent out there. And I believe Sam Raimi had seen The Demolitionist and recommended me to them. But it was a long process. I probably went in for about 5 director auditions, where you go in and you pitch your concept for the film and you show them what ideas you have. Maybe for me, it's easy. I always come up with artwork, some sort of sketch or something to show them like what I'm thinking. So I ended up going in about 5 times. Each time I was like, I don't have this. I'm amazed I'm getting callbacks, but I always walk out kind of going, oh, stick to my day job for the next year, doing effects. So, and then on the 5th callback, I went in again. Each time I kind of was introduced to someone else in the chain of command at a production company. At the end of the 5th meeting, they said, okay, you have the gig.
Once the pair were aboard, Robert Kurtzman and Peter Atkins started to rework the script. Thankfully, the redrafting process was easier than the auditions were for Robert Kurtzman. Both Peter and Robert talk about how easy the process was.
I'd probably done 3 drafts. And after the 3rd draft, they started looking around for directors and they brought Bob Kurtzman in. I've been very lucky with the directors who filmed my scripts because, I ended up being friends with them apart from anything else. And Bob and I were like old Monster kids, Famous Monster as a Filmline magazine reading as kids. So, so we clicked almost immediately and we kept polishing it. I think I did a couple more drafts after Bob, but it's not like Bob walked in with some sort of haughty auteur notion that required me to do massive rewrites. We honed it up. It was a really lovely process, to be honest, because you can have difficult times with directors.
I met with Peter. We went through the script. We made some changes, not to the script overall, but some effect sequences, mainly so that we could achieve them in the amount of time and on a budget with less visual effect. Because the original ending, how the artwork came to life was more magical and not possible. That all got changed. When I came on board, it all went practical.
The script was set and the director was in place. But one key component was still missing. Who would play the movie's central villain, the Djinn? Step up Andrew Divoff. Andrew had already starred in movies such as Toy Soldiers, Graveyard Shift and Another 48 Hours. But with Wishmaster, he wasn't too sure what to expect.
I showed up for the audition not knowing really what to expect. And of course, when I say what to expect, mostly I knew that, I would eventually see the costume, the makeup and all. I knew that would be taken care of. It was just doing the words on the paper. And I honestly, I said to myself, holy crap, man, there's no way they're even going to, consider me.
However, they did. And Andrew Divoff was to play the Djinn as well as his human counterpart Nathaniel Demerest. But a horror movie with a small budget needed that little something else. Enter the Tom Hanks of the horror genre, Wes Craven. Here is Robert Kurtzman to explain more.
The deal breaker was they really couldn't afford, I hate to say it, but like a big bankable name on a genre picture. It's really hard to get those, you can't get Tom Hanks in The Wishmaster, and for them, the next best thing was having a producer on board that was a well-known name, like Wes Craven, John Carpenter, Sam Raimi. The good thing is I had relationships with all of them, but Wes responded really well to it. And I had done like 4 movies now with Wes or so. I think it was like, oh, no, this is a cool idea. He liked Peter. He knew me. So it just fell together. And he came on board and kind of was, he was kind of a mentoring soul on it.
But Wes Craven not only added that bit of star power, but he also, according to Peter Atkins, looked over the script.
I think Pierre or Eric at one point told me, well, this is just a self-serving story. And they were probably just butchering up. Somebody said, Wes wouldn't take the money just for the sake of the money. He insisted on reading the script and he really liked it. So thanks to you is how we got. I don't know if that's true. I met him only twice. when on set, and it was great. He was Wes Craven. I was thrilled to meet him.
The pieces seemed to be in place, and the amazing horror pedigree behind the camera was to be matched with amazing horror pedigree in front of the camera, most of which was achievable with Robert Kurtzman's phone book.
I'm describing a fictional scene, which is nonetheless true. But in effect, Bob said something like, "Oh, I'll get Ted Raimi to come in and do that." And I said, "Fucking hell, who else have you got in your phone book?" And he said, "Everybody." But I think it was a more slow thing that we suddenly realized, oh yeah, let's call in all those favors. And so Bob got everybody in.
I wanted to work with my friends. So like there's a lot of people I'd worked with before, like Ted Raimi or Danny Hicks and Robert and Angus Scrimm. So basically, as we were putting it together, I kind of found part that would fit them perfectly, And then once I started getting Kane, and then it became that whole like, okay, wait a minute, this might be a marketing hook. Can we get we got Freddie in there, we got Jason in there, and then Tony Todd. Now I hadn't worked with Tony, and so Tony came on for those several days. And so they had like 3 Titans of Horror, and then they introduced the new characters, kind of became the plan, use this press and then say we're now introducing the next horror icon,
Peter Atkins concurs that having Horror Hall of Famers was great for marketing, but it wasn't planned in advance.
That was certainly not conscious. Well, clearly it wasn't conscious when I wrote it because they weren't going to be played by those people. I think in terms of they wanted to bolster the project by having those names, because Andy was superb as the Djinn, but he wasn't. It wasn't like casting Robert as the Djinn. We weren't bringing an existing horror star in to be our central monster. There might have been a more level-headed at the executive end. It's not bad to tell Fangoria that we've got Tony and Robert and Kane and Reggie. But there might have been, let's add some star power. But Andy was fantastic in the role and, has quietly entered the pantheon of those 80s and 90s horror character monsters.
Now, Robert Kurtzman previously mentioned that one of the only people that he hadn't worked with before was Tony Todd. Thankfully, Peter Atkins was on hand to help. But in order to get Tony onto the project, he had to become a smooth manipulator.
I can claim credit for Tony Todd. Shannon Golding, who was the creative exec at Live, said, you got to schmooze him. You've got to get on a call with me and Tony. So I had to sort of on the spot say to Tony, who I'd met briefly. And so I just lied and said, "Oh, no, they must have sent you the wrong draft, Tony. No. His name's Johnny Valentine. He's got a whole backstory, and we're going to do this." And I don't know. And by the end of the phone call, I think it was nothing to do with my bullshit. I think it was the fact it was, I met this guy, it's cool. So Tony had said yes. And as soon as we hung up on the conference call, Shannon called me back and said, "You should be an executive. You're a smooth manipulator." And I thought, is that meant to be a fucking compliment? Jesus Christ.
So, all the monsters have been suitably schmoozed to appear in the movie. But what was it like to act opposite them? Andrew Divoff has nothing but good things to say.
It was wonderful. I said then, and I continue to say that I was so honored that they would come aboard. All of them had a lot of insight for the new kid. And that was quite wonderful. But I must say, to a man, and being on set with those monsters, and again, having their insight, and they were all very respectful.
Now, Andrew Divoff was playing a new monster, but that monster had a human side. Or at least it looked human. So how did he approach the characters of the Djinn and Nathaniel Demerest?
It's a bit schizophrenic for me because I had different opinions about both sides of that character. Of course, the one side being the Djinn, and then the other being Demerest. And I remember early on, I believe it was the first scene that we shot was in the shop where the very helpful, gorgeous young lady gets turned into a forever mannequin, and I just wasn't sure how that Demerest would play. Does he seem sort of awfully snobby, very conceited, and then yes, he does. But that's coming from the Djinn, so that was kind of a lovely sort of a crossing of the beings there that see, I wanted to play Demerest in such a way that he would be the creepy one. And the Djinn was just the everyday dude.
Andrew Divoff had his characters down, but there was still one thing that was concerning him, and that one thing was still a problem even after the cameras had started to roll.
My concern, what would the voice be? What would it sound like? And so I was a little not stressed out, but it was definitely on the mind because I wasn't landing on anything. The night that we filmed in Wilmington, and Bob had a great suggestion. First time with the makeup on, and in that beautiful ragged hooded coat. And Robert very wisely said, "Why don't you go get in your trailer, sit in front of the mirror with the lights as dim as possible, and talk to yourself, get to know that thing in the mirror." And so it was, as I say, a little bit of serendipity. I'd had some candy, some chocolate, and I noticed that it sort of coated the throat, caused it to be phlegmy, and I didn't cough it up. I kept it in there, and so that the sound would come through that. So that was really, for me, that was sort of the starting gun on, okay, we're off and kind of running, we're off and limping.
So, Andrew was allowed time to harness the voice of the Djinn because of a delay in production. But what caused that delay? Here is Robert Kurtzman to give the full picture.
The second day of shooting, we were shooting that whole opening, that pharmacy sequence with Buck Flower and Reggie Bannister, and everybody thinks Tom Savini's in it, but he is not in it. Just some guy, an extra, looked like Tom Savini. Anyway, I got a phone call from Russ Markowitz, our line producer, who said, turn on the news this morning. This is on my way to go to set. And so I turned the news on, and there's helicopters following it was our camera truck down the street. The back door was open and cameras are falling out on the road. Some transient or whatever broke into the lockup and stole the camera truck that night. So we had a slight delay in shooting that day, and I had to try to make it up by the end of the night. I had to get the same amount of footage. And I remember 2 or so hours once we got to set of sitting around waiting for them to wrangle new cameras. And then we started our day. So we had to shift things around that day. But it was just interesting, to wake up the second day of shooting and then go, oh, God, are we cursed?
Thankfully, production wasn't cursed. Not entirely, anyway. And Andrew Divoff's metaphorical limping turned into a full-blown sprint when he got completely into character. So much so that he scared the crew.
I was very aware, once that makeup went on, that there was a completely different presence on set than when I was Nathaniel Demerest, and also the relationship to the crew. A lot of times I would be sort of propped up on the wall. I had an RC motor, a remote control motor on my back that would articulate the tentacles every now and then, so I couldn't really sit in a chair. They had a board and they'd sort of lean me back. And then I remember some of the PAs, that they'd be walking by and they'd take a second look. They'd get a little closer without wanting to get too close, and they'd say, "Are you all right? Do you need anything?" And I'd mumble something. I'd gurgle out some words, and they'd just kind of go on their way. But it was in good fun. And several of the crew, especially at the wrap party later, came up and said, "Dude, man, when you were in that outfit, we just didn't want anything to do with you. I mean, you were the nicest person, but even just keeping quiet like that, it was just an ominous thing having you in the room. So that's exactly what you want." And I feed, actors feed off that sort of off the vibes.
Andrew Divoff may have fed off of those vibes during production, but he certainly didn't feed off of them when Karen Wagner, the movie's costume designer, asked him if he wanted to keep the Djinn costume.
I had the full garb on me, and it was the last day of shooting, and we were to do one more scene. And so Karen comes up having a very pleasant conversation, and she says, would you like to keep the costume? Now, I mean, what should anybody on the effing planet say to that? I said, F no. And I was being bitchy and stupid. And I kicked myself in the ass every time somebody brings it up.
Now, Andrew had 2 roles in the movie, but he wasn't the only one. Robert Kurtzman was juggling directing and being an effects artist, but it's something he managed rather well by preparing in advance.
Other than, setting up the shots and knowing exactly what I wanted. We storyboarded a lot of this. My kind of job ends after prep. When we start shooting, I've already done the work with the KNB people, Howard and Greg, and the other artists that are making things. They're already set on a path at that point, and we know what we're building. So when I get to set, it's basically them, KNB EFX, executing everything on set, and I'm then able to concentrate on working with Andy and worrying about the day-to-day issues of making the movie. The effects part was always a fun part for me. So when I was in that world, I was in my world already. I'm a monster kid. So especially with the action, I like shooting a lot of action stuff. You know, the beginning and the end of the movie are like kind of balls out action sequences.
Two of the balls out action sequences were the opening and end scenes, where lavish and fancy parties descend into people dying in the goriest ways possible. Someone turns into a tree, another turns into a snake, someone's skeleton rips through its own body. But when you have KNB on a project, you have the scope to carry out these sorts of effects.
Once we had Bob and automatically therefore had KNB on board, I'm sure a lot of the fun incidental deaths, which I can certainly claim credit for many of them, but I'm sure there were things in the fourth and fifth draft after Bob was on board that will have been a consequence of Bob saying, I've always wanted to do an effect where... And it's like, oh, well, let me write that up.
And there was always special attention to detail with these creative effects, even on details that the audience wasn't likely to see.
The scene in the station, in the police station, the gentleman who gets his jaw torn off his face, he is a makeup artist, and the detail that he put into that fake jaw, I mean, down to the teeth and the fillings in the teeth, my friend. And I'm an artist. I dare say myself, I sculpt and I paint. And I got to tell you, I saw that and I thought, wow.
However, this wasn't that gentleman's only death in the film. Robert Kurtzman gives a little more detail.
That was Greg Funk who played that part. He also played the Snake Man. This is why we use him, because his life cast. So we're like, what characters can we do on the people that we have cast for? So Greg played that character. He played the Snake Man, and he also played the two statues that come to life in the Room of Gods when Alexander runs in at the end, right before the big showdown, and the two statues on the side turn to her. Those are also him in makeups with, we had the fake pedestal, and then we had him up behind it with the makeup on,
But with so many practical effects, deaths, and action sequences, you will always need that bit of additional help. Here's Peter Atkins.
We not only had KNB, but it was such an effects-heavy movie on such a relatively limited budget that we actually had two shops, KNB doing the majority of the effects, but we brought Gary in to do... I know Gary's very proud of the skeleton climbing out of its own body sequence in the opening thing.
The effects guys weren't just playing a key role behind the scenes, they were more than happy to get involved on camera too. But this is to be expected when there is such an easy and friendly working atmosphere.
Yeah, all the performers in the suits were the effects guys from KNB. Anytime you do a movie to try to work with people that you're comfortable with and that you have a creative second hand with, that, it makes everything easier. You can talk to somebody about an idea and they get exactly where you're coming from. It made sense with that. Also, on Night of the Creeps, that's how we did that. All the effects guys played the zombies because we needed to get the effects work done, and we couldn't sit around waiting for casting to find people to play these parts. They perform either in suits or they're like funny guys. Everybody has like sense of humor. Everybody likes to do things, and everybody loves to play a monster. So anytime you can put one of those guys in a suit, usually they're happy to do it. They get into it. So it made a lot of sense when we had them there to test fit.
And Robert Kurtzman had to get involved on camera too, especially as he had a head for effects. When asked about his favourite death, he answered,
well, my own. I had to get my head, I had to die in the movie. That was it. So I pulled my own head off.
However, amid the multitude of effects, there were always going to be some small hiccups or concussions on the set. Robert Kurtzman and Andrew Divoff discuss how trying to depict someone blowing their brains out with a gun really is as dangerous as it sounds.
One of the things was when Andy blows his head off. I know we had a day where we actually blew a squib off on Andy's head, and it whacked his head and gave him a concussion. It was just not properly put on. But that's happy incident, thank God. thank you for going through that, Andy, led to us having a better gag there, because we did this really cool, at the time, compositing of the top of a fake piece of Andy's head that had an air cannon in it that could blow all the brains out of the top. And we composited onto Andy's real head in the makeup. And it worked really well. But prior to that, it was just a blood bag blowing on fireplace in the background. It was a happy, accident that got us a better shot.
The gentleman doing the squibs, doing the pyro, is a fantastic pyro guy. The variable that I failed to mention was the fact that at my head, that those antennae that I mentioned that articulate with the RC motor, well, they were on a base, and it was sort of molded to the shape of the head. You have my head, and you have the makeup cowl, and then you have this plate floating in there. Well, it was the D80s. There were two of them, and that's about, I believe that's the equivalent to a 45 slug. And I was, as I say, I was not paying attention, and so essentially what you have then is a missile that was sent into my head. It was repeated to me, and it was repeated and repeated and repeated. Make sure that when you do that blast, that you toss your head back. Make sure you toss your head back. Make sure you toss your head back. And I had every intention of tossing my head back, but there was a greater force literally caused me to lean into the shot that brought about that line, "That hurt like hell," and it did. It did.
But the guys didn't want to just limit the dangerous activity to gunshots and concussions. They also managed to turn up the heat as well.
We did have a fire day on set, which shut us down for an entire afternoon. So we had to basically shut down halfway through the day. And the scene where we blew up all the statues at the end, we had all the statues rigged to explode. We had a room. It was a room of God, so it only had one entrance. And we didn't even realize that when we were shooting, even the fire marshal was standing next to us when this all went down bad. And we all turned around to go out the other direction and realized there's no door. There's a wall and no way to get out of here. So we had to literally just run around the fire as fast as we could on the outer edge of the set. And then they tried to put it out. By the time they got it out, everything was fine. Like the set wasn't like totally damaged or anything. It did melt. Two of our 35 millimeter cameras were caught in it. And we shut down for the afternoon just to air out the building. We had all this toxic fumes in there from the exploding foam pieces and stuff that got lit up.
Despite these little issues during filming, the movie was completed and eventually released on September 19th, 1997, grossing just under $16 million domestically. Things had come a long way for Andrew Divoff, who is now a firmly established horror boogeyman, and this is something his family got to see firsthand.
And the studio had arranged for me and my family being my sister and her three kids, to get into the theater and be able to see it with a live audience. And that was very informative. I mean, I sat in the back and I got so enthralled with the movie. Every now and then, at the scares and at the laughs, the audience would react and it would pull me out of the focus. But I must say, I was mesmerized by watching it on film, and especially with my family. And my nephew and nieces were just at the age when it's okay to watch this. So I could tell the littlest one, I kept kind of looking over at her, and she was just like, she was frozen in her seat staring. So that was a good thing.
Andrew Divoff's niece wasn't the only one who was given a scare at the movie theatre. 8 months prior to Wishmaster's release, Wes Craven's Scream hit theatres. Scream had new rules, new conventions and a new style. But did this help or hinder Wishmaster's success? Robert Kurtzman gives his opinion.
Well, it definitely it definitely became the throwback once Scream came out. And it's also not that kind of movie. Wishmaster is a fantasy film. It's got magical elements in it. And it's got otherworldly things. So it's not the same as the kind of grounded world that Scream takes place in.
Robert Kurtzman's point is echoed by Peter Atkins, who also feels that the movie is a farewell to 80s horror.
Oh, I mean, it was always good news when any horror movie did well. We had a sense that this was going to be the last gasp for the time being of that particular type of character monster. Freddy, Jason, Pinhead, Leatherface, Michael Myers. So Scream had happened, Blair Witch was about to happen. But Wishmaster is really an 80s horror movie. even though it's way late to be an 80s horror movie. There was a conscious or unconscious sense that in a way it was a valediction, a farewell kiss to that type, that subgenre. I feel like I'm bad-mouthing my own, it's like a sad metal band we're still trying to play in the age of punk.
Could be one of the many reasons for its success and continued popularity. A sequel was released just 2 years later, but sadly Robert Kurtzman and Peter Atkins did not return as director and writer respectively. Although this wasn't always the case, here's Peter Atkins with more.
I think there was an assumption that there would be a sequel and that, the smart thing would be to use the team that gave you. I know at some point we had talked with somebody. So I'm not sure what happened. I mean, to be honest, no disrespect to the movie. I love it and had a great time, and I'm very fond of everybody. But it wasn't like I was sort of hanging on thinking, oh my God, let them make Wishmaster 2 and let me write it. So I wasn't upset by it.
Robert also explains that changes behind the scenes not only stopped him from directing Wishmaster 2, but it also threatened the theatrical release of the first Wishmaster movie.
At one time, I was going to direct a sequel for it. Live Entertainment, who put out the movie and produced it, they were taken over by a company called Bain Capital at the time. We were in post-production when they basically got bought out. So we were terrified that our movie wasn't going to come out in the theaters anymore, that it was just going to go straight to video and that the new regime would come in and scrap it. They did come in and scrap some of our ad money. Then everybody that we had worked with at Live, that we had the relationships with, weren't there anymore. So whatever, it was a couple years later they did the sequel. At that point, it was all new people and it was another company. And I mean, eventually it would shift hands so many times, that library. It's at Lionsgate now. It started out as Live and then it turned to Artisan after Bain Capital, I think. And I don't know, it got all wonkety in there. So,
despite not being involved, there may be a little bit of Peter Atkins and Robert Kurtzman in Wishmaster 2, especially in regards to the opening scene.
Bob and I had pitched the opening as a heist. So maybe in a tiny little way, Bob and I do have a presence in Wishmaster 2. Although, it's hardly the most original idea in
Despite
the world.
Not returning for a sequel, Peter Atkins and Robert Kurtzman were a huge part of the first movie's success. And the movie's continued popularity has helped spawn 3 sequels, a range of collectible figures, t-shirts, a novelisation, and more. Andrew Divoff returned for 1 sequel, further cementing his legacy within the horror genre. Even though the sequel didn't hit the same highs as the first, Andrew Divoff's portrayal of the Djinn immortalised the character as a long-standing and celebrated boogeyman. Wishmaster may be 25 years old, but its practical effects still stand up amidst a world of CGI. If you haven't already seen this movie, go seek it out and enjoy. Try and spot all the horror cameos and discover your new favourite one-liners. I would like to say thank you to Peter Atkins, Robert Kurtzman and Andrew Divoff for taking part in this podcast. Please share on social media and subscribe to the Corpse Club if you haven't already. I'm James Doherty, and thank you for listening.